So this will be part of the ongoing series of the book of John, Contemplative Theologian. John 9 will be discussed today, and I want to look at the difference between those who think they see are blind, and often those who are blind learning to see. And John 9 is really a reflection on the difference. It really is a companion chapter to chapter 8, in which those who build their stone houses of ideas are willing to those who disagree with them, just as the beginning of John 8 and the end of John 8 ends with stoning. The beginning of John 8 and 9 is about people who think they know what reality is, and as a result they're quite willing to stone others who see things or interpret things a little differently. So stoning can be literal or metaphorical, and we can see again and again in our world today how people who ideologically build their houses of reality, and then those who don't fit within those houses or don't totally agree, how stoning, rhetorically, things can be said to others in which they throw their rhetorical stones at others. So the notion of stoning has certainly not gone away. Chapter 9, again, we have the clash between, and this is a perennial theme in John, between the Pharisees and Jesus. I want to return briefly again to the dilemma of the Pharisees, because it is an important dilemma. The Pharisees have often been maligned as the enemies of Jesus, and yet the Pharisaical vocation, just as the Sanhedrin itself, is not an easy one at all. Any institutions that are important in life have Sanhedrins or Pharisaical class. If a person wants to be, you have a university, you have a senate. That essentially is a Sanhedrin. In law, you have people who are appointed to be overseers of the law. You have people in medical profession who see themselves as the guardians and the protectors of what's legitimate medical practice, and when it goes bad, they inevitably have to step in. There are within Sanhedrins those who are more conservative and those who are more liberal. Just as in the Jewish tradition, the Pharisees were a little more liberal and the Sadducees were a little more conservative. So in any area of life, you have people who are responsible for upholding the dignity and the authenticity of their particular profession. And that's not just a religious issue, that's political. We see elections going on here in the United States right now. You'll have the Republicans following Trump. They are ones who are defending the Sanhedrin of Trump's ideology. We'll get the same thing within the Democrats. In political parties in Canada, Conservatives, Liberals, NDP, Greens, there are people who are guardians of the ideology of which they stand for. And so it's not only a religious issue, it's a political issue, and then the professions like I mentioned, like medicine, like dentistry, and things like being an electrician or a plumber. There are people who are, in a sense, the guardians of those who go through the courses, and if people claim to be trained in an area, but they're abusing what that means, they step in to evaluate them. And so in John 9, as in John 8, the Pharisees, which would have been the most liberal of the Sanhedrin at that time, are just asking legitimate questions about the claims that Jesus is making. And there's nothing unnatural about that, in a sense, because he is coming and challenging a way of, take for example in Canada, the medical profession. A few decades ago, someone like Tommy Douglas comes along and says, I think medicine should be made public and run by the federal government so that all have access to universal health care. Well, the medical profession was one of his leading opponents. The Sanhedrin basically wanted to keep it private. He wanted to make it public. And so we can go on with a variety of illustrations of how people from various professions, political parties, protect their understanding of what they understand is the profession or the ideology of a political party or religious community. And in that sense, they will throw stones. So what Trump is doing and his people throwing stones at the Democrats throw stones at the Republicans. We've just had a leadership election in Canada for the new Conservative Party. Within the debates, they are kindly throwing stones at one another, each thinking that their interpretation in terms of what the leadership of the Conservative Party should look like is the right one. And so what Jesus is dealing with the Pharisees, it's just a predictable tendency of any group that thinks they are the guardians of a heritage to ask what, particularly if someone is seen as threatening that particular understanding or offering an alternate read, as asking them meaningful questions. Now, John 9 is about a person who is born blind. Okay, so we can read that literally. Historically, a person is born blind, and so Jesus comes and heals him in that sense. Now, that can be read, of course, tropologically or existentially. And then we all are, in our different ways, born blind. We see through a glass darkly. We don't see perfectly. We don't see exhaustively. We don't see comprehensively. And so John 9 is about every person on their journey. And Jesus encounters them on that journey. And it's only when a person is willing to honestly recognize, yes, there's a blindness, there's scales, there's cataracts on the eyes of my soul, that person is in a position to begin to see in some small way. And so there's the literal approach in John 9 in which Jesus encounters the blind person. And then there's the perennial theme in this, in which we are all born to some degree limited in soul sight, and hence needing our eyes cleansed so we can see better. So what Jesus does, of course, so we can look at this literally or tropologically or existentially, in which the man is coming out, he has to go to the pool of Siloam, which means sent, and he has to wash himself. So he has to be willing to be sent from where he is, willing to recognize his blindness. And if people don't recognize their internal blindness, then they're not likely to move too far in the human journey. So Jesus sends him out to wash in the pool. So inevitably the eyes of the soul have to be rinsed. They have to be washed to see properly. Interesting. So this man has the internal, at a literal level, eagerness to see, but anyone metaphorically who wishes to see has to be willing to be sent away from their place of blindness, which they may not even recognize because they're so absorbed in their skin encapsulated ego, as Alan Watts would say, that they can't see that they are blind, or that the way they are seeing a situation or another person or a circumstance is somewhat skewed by the way they see. The blind man, or all of us in that sense are blind, has to be willing to wash the eyes of the soul and be sent away from a way of seeing into a new way of seeing itself. Now, interestingly, Jesus is then confronted as the man begins to see. He's willing to wash himself or be washed, the washing of the soul. Of course, the eyes of the soul he begins to see, and inevitably he collides with the Pharisees, who wonder, why is Jesus doing this on the Sabbath? Because is not the Sabbath formally and legally a time of rest? And so the Pharisees have defined what authentic religion is. It'd be a bit like, and then they throw stones or they question and interrogate Jesus, because they've identified genuine Judaism with Sabbath, and those who violate it in the name of helping people see must be somehow counterfeits of genuine Judaism. Now, we can apply this today. Obviously, it isn't the Sabbath that we're dealing with, but what are the issues that people have today that identify their Christianity with certain formal positions that then blind them from seeing how others may be true? So, for example, historically, People have seen that the Roman Catholic Church is the pure church. Well, that then blinds them from seeing how the Orthodox or Anglican might be true, or Anglican or Orthodox of certain Orthodox traditions. Well, if the pure form of Christianity is Orthodox, so you throw stones, or you don't see the good in other traditions in that sense. Or people who say, for example, I was doing a debate the other week with someone on a book of mine, Jordan Peterson. He made it very clear he was a young earth theorist, and you take Genesis 1 and 2 in a literal way, and if people didn't do that, then they weren't genuine Christians. Well, you see, you have a worldview at work here that throws stones at people who don't accept a certain interpretation. We have various people at election time who think Jesus equals republicanism, or Jesus equals Democrat or conservative or liberal or green or NDP, and then they throw stones at people who aren't in that. And so if we look at the Sabbath issue, not in a literal sense again, but look at the perennial nature of how people get blinded. They get blinded. And interesting, the word for Greek in blind, it's tuflon, but fascinating enough, the word tufome or tufao is a person who creates smoke and haughtiness as well. So a blind person thinks that the smoke, as it were, that they're creating, or the image that they're creating, or the reality they're creating is reality itself. And so a person who is arrogant or haughty, or thinks their interpretation of reality is the only one, they are blind. They're blinded by their perception, by their interpretation. And so John 8 is really about what makes a person see, and those people who think they see are blind because they've restricted how they will interpret a tradition in a certain limited way. It's really back to John 8 again. This is just a different metaphor. One is we build our houses really become stones that prevent us from seeing, and then we throw stones at those who don't see the way we do. And so we get this stone seeing, non-seeing, and Jesus is really challenging in many ways the tendencies within any of us to think that our perception is clear and clean, comprehensive, and defines reality in itself. And so the dilemma of the Pharisee is one in which, particularly the ones who are confronting Jesus, as I mentioned last week, the one branch of the Pharisees, the Hillel school, was much more moderate. And there was a recognition that, in fact, there were various ways of interpreting the Jewish tradition, but the Shammai school was much more aggressive in its understanding. And they're the ones who tend to be going after Jesus. Interestingly enough, St. Paul is trained as a young man in the Hillel Gamaliel tradition, but he swings over to the Shammai tradition, and hence his intense persecution of early Christianity. And it wasn't until his Damascus experience that the transition. But there you have again St. Paul. His interpretation of Judaism is the true one. He will stone, he will persecute, he will chase others. So John 9, like John 8, is very much a warning to those who, as it were, are the guardians of a tradition, who see themselves legitimately so, as saying there is a framework, there is accountability. So whether, as I mentioned earlier, someone is a medical doctor or a dentist, there is with any of these professions a sense you protect the integrity of it, so that people can trust you as doctors and dentists and electricians and plumbers. But when someone comes along to challenge it, and particularly challenge it for perhaps taking it to a deeper, a more innovative level, often the Pharisees then come out, as it were metaphorically, the Pharisees come out and challenge that sort of different interpretation of things. So the dilemma of a Pharisee, the good of it is they're trying to say there are standards by which people can trust people. The danger always of saying there are standards is that the standards one upholds can then become blind to those who are bringing innovative and creative insights into a medical profession, a dental profession, and then the advances forward are not made. So when Jesus confronts the Pharisees, they have decided what authentic Judaism is. He comes along interpreting their text and saying there's alternate ways of interpreting these things. And so John 9, like John 8, is working on metaphors of the soul, really, metaphors of transformation. And if people do not have the humility in that sense to say, this house of stone I am building and the people who are coming to live in it, or it can be a cathedral, or it can be a great house of thought that is being built. The danger always of those who are protecting these great traditions is that they can be excluding the very people that understand the spirit of the tradition in a much more genuine, innovative, creative manner. Now the danger, some people will say, well, it's just the innovator, it's just the creator. Well, that only takes you so far along any path, because any profession, any political party, any religious community, as it grows and communities come along, is in the process of saying this is what we stand for, this is what we don't stand for. And so there's always this tension between, and I'll just perhaps conclude here with an interesting, a friend of mine teaches political science at UT, Ronald Biner. He did his PhD on Charles Taylor, one of our great Canadian political philosophers. He looks at the young Charles Taylor, who was very convinced that the NDP was the way to go in terms of economic, social, political directions, drawing the line in the sand. Leftist politics was the way future into making a good country, a good civilization. And so anyone who differed with the left, in that sense, Labour in England, variations of the left in Canada, was somehow a part of a political tradition that was an oppressive class, in that sense, bourgeois, proletariat, and they were siding with the business community contra the working class people. And so that sort of ideological outlook, and then the party which embodies it is very much building a house of stone in which a certain worldview is articulated, certain people are invited in, but if you don't agree with that family, then, as it were, one is excluded or stones are thrown at someone. Now, as Taylor moves along in his journey, influenced by Hans-Georg Gadamer and a variety of other thinkers, you get the notion of hermeneutical generosity. So versus social criticism, in which lines are drawn in the sand. Now, hermeneutical generosity is such in which you listen to different perspectives. There's different interpretations. People come from different backgrounds. And so as Taylor has moved from a position in the 1950s and 60s and early 1970s to very much drawing lines in the sand, the house of ideology is built, in which there is a certain right, there is good, better, best, there is right, wrong, to hermeneutical generosity. He comes to see that there are various ways of interpreting the political good, the common good, the interpersonal good in that sense. The dilemma of that, of course, of hermeneutical generosity, is there's just perspectives, and that's all there is, and the person just tries to be sent. So it's very difficult to build any sort of a community along just, oh, you've got your opinion, I've got mine, we differ. Does anything hold us together any more than just hermeneutical generosity? And so the dilemma of living in this tension between, on the one hand, saying there are certain criteria for a genuine community, religious, political, medical, electricians, plumbers, you name it, by which defines the community. But the danger of that is innovative people get marginalized. They're often called the prophetic people. The other is to swing the other way and say there's just perspectives and nothing is right and wrong. The strength of that is there's listening. The difficulty of that more anarchist approach is a community really cannot be built on everybody has their own perspectives and we just sit around and listen to one another. And it's living in this tension, which is a much more difficult one, of hermeneutical generosity, of listening. And this was the Gamaliel tradition within Judaism of Jesus' time. But the Pharisees of John John 9 and John 8 and earlier, and we'll see it later because it reaches increasingly a climax, obviously, with Jesus' death, well, his trial, death, and crucifixion. This is building bit by bit. The momentum is gaining between a certain understanding of what is genuine Judaism and then the challenge and critique of that by Jesus. But it comes down to then, so as I mentioned, this chapter 9 is about blindness, and underneath blindness, beyond just literal blindness, was first of all what Jesus is getting at, of course, and what the John 9 is about metaphorically. We are all born blind. What's the nature of washing? And then under the metaphor in the midst of blindness is a person who is haughty. They think the smoke that they're creating is reality, when all itself is just a thin smoke texture that blinds people from seeing in a minimal way. And underneath that, the smoke, as it were, that they create, that they call reality, which is passing, is a haughty person, an arrogant person who's convinced their interpretation of reality, whether it's a communal interpretation, whether it's agnosticism, whether it's, but I'm right, and anyone who differs with me is wrong. So a person, so blindness in that sense is just not literal in the John 9 sense. There can be soul blindness that comes from internal haughtiness, in which people spin out their little smoke stream of reality that has very little to do with actual reality and self. So that's what Jesus is challenging, both in John 8 and 9, internal perceptions, and where we get our perceptions from, and how then in John 9 they blind us to truth as it's coming. And this is why Jesus goes right to the internal. It's just not external, because it's how we see will determine what we see, and what we are in touch with and listening to in ourselves will determine what we see, and then how we relate to others in that seeing, in that perception. So John 8 and 9 are companion chapters in terms of two metaphors. Really, they're hermeneutical metaphors in terms of the seeing and not seeing, and those who are willing to recognize they're blind, they're on their way to seeing. Those who think they see, they in fact are blind, but they have to deal with what's the source of the blindness deep within that refuses to have the minimal humility to say, I might be wrong in how I'm interpreting this person, this situation, this particular context. And so John 8 and 9, foundational, and then as we move on to John 10, we get into, of course, Jesus is the shepherd of being, drawing from Psalm 23. And so philosophy is very important. What John is working on here, some very important themes, both theologically, exegetically, and then philosophically, of what does it mean to be a shepherd of being in terms of people as they're trying to find their way forward on their journey into greater depth and meaning. And so John 8 and 9, companion chapters about each person beyond the literal level of the text itself, grappling with the issue of being careful of stoning others metaphorically who we differ with, or what's the nature of our own blindness and how is it preventing us from seeing the logos, the presence of the divine as it comes to us, because we have, through the use of our will, the ability, in fact, to blind ourselves through the smoke that we are sending out, blinds us from the blue sky, which is just above us. And these are our choices in which we choose to go deeper, face these issues, or suffer the consequences of being blind while thinking we see.